I have an idea. Let's complicate things. We can't let anyone publish a cheese listing. Only the owner or an admin should be able to do that. But we already have that covered thanks to the security attribute on the cheese listing put operation. It has security equals is granted edit object, which activates a custom voter that we created in the last tutorial, cheese listing voter. This looks for that edit attribute and checks to make sure that the current user is the owner of the cheese listing or is an admin. So it's already true that only the owner or an admin can even hit this put operation. But now we have a new requirement. To prevent low-quality listings from being added, our business team has told us that an owner can only publish a cheese listing if the description is at least 100 characters. If it's shorter, publishing should fail with a 400 status code. Oh, but the business people also said that this rule should not apply to admins. They should be able to publish no matter how short the description is. Okay, let's start with a test to describe all this craziness. In Cheese Listing Resource Test, to make sure that our test published cheese listing keeps working, we need to give cheese listing a longer description. If you look in Cheese Listing Factory, Source Factory Cheese Listing Factory, by default, the description is short. But I've already added something called a state method with long description. If we call this on the factory, it will set the description to 3 paragraphs via faker, which will definitely be long enough. In other words, inside the test, we can add arrow with long description to make sure that the cheese listing created will have a long enough description. Thanks to this, once we add the new restrictions, this test should still pass. Below this, I'm going to paste in a new test method, which you can get from the code block on this page. Let's walk through it real quick. We start by creating a cheese listing with a short description, logging in as the owner of that listing, trying to publish it, and checking for a 400 status code. Next, we log in as an admin user, do the same thing, and check that this does work. I also have a test that logs back in as the normal user and changes something different, just to make sure normal edits still work. Finally, the last 2 parts are for unpublishing. In our system, unpublishing is something that only an admin can do. To test that, we log in as a normal user, try to set is published to false, and make sure it doesn't work. Then we log in as an admin and make sure that it does work. Phew! And yes, we could and maybe should break this test into smaller test methods to make debugging easier. I'm being a bit lazy by combining them. So, how can we accomplish all of this? Well, first, is this a security check or a validation check? Because sometimes the difference between the two is blurry. In theory, we could do something inside the security attribute. The expression has a variable called previous_object, which is the object before it was updated. So we could compare the previous objects is published with the objects is published and do different things. Or, to keep this readable, we could even pass both the object and previous object into a voter as an array. That seems a little crazy to me, but it would probably work. However, I tend to view things like this. Security is best when you're trying to completely prevent access to an operation. Validation is best when the restrictions you need to apply are based on the data that's being sent, like preventing a field from changing to some value. That's true even if those values depend on the authenticated user. In other words, we're going to create a custom validator. At your terminal, run bin console make:\validator. I'll call it valid is published. This generated 2 classes, a class that represents the annotation and also a class that holds the actual validator logic. We can see both inside source/validator. Before we add any logic to either class, let's use the annotation in cheese listing. So, above the cheese listing class, add @validIsPublished. Now, the reason we're adding this above the class and not above the isPublished property is that our validator will need access to the entire cheese listing object so that it can check both the isPublished and description properties. If we had put this above isPublished, then only that field would be passed to us. Let's try the test and see what the failure looks like right now. Over in the test class, copy the new method name, and then run Symfony PHP bin/PHP unit --filter equals test published cheese listing validation. And it had an error. Let's see what's going on. Constraint valid is published cannot be put on classes. By default, constraint annotations are only allowed to be placed above properties, not above the class. To change that, inside the validator class, we need to do two things. First, add @target and pass this class. Second, I'll go to code generate or Command N on a Mac and select override methods to override get targets. Make this return self::class_constraint. Now our annotation can be put above a class. This means that when our cheese listing is validated, Symfony will call validIsPublished validator, and this value will be the cheese listing object. Real quick, if you're not familiar with how custom validators work, by default, if I add @validIsPublished, then Symfony will look for a service called validIsPublished validator. So these two classes are already connected via this naming convention. Let's start with a sanity check right here. If not value instance of cheese listing, then throw a new logic exception, though the exact exception class doesn't matter, and say, only cheese listing is supported. This is just to make sure that if we accidentally add @validIsPublished above a different class, someone will yell at us. Now dd value, so we can be absolutely sure that we know what this looks like. Back to the tests. Run, and yes! The validator is called, and our cheese listing object has isPublished set to true because this is the cheese listing after the new data has been deserialized into it. The failure is from our first test case. We currently allow this item to be published even though the description is short. Next, let's prevent this. How? It's back to our original data trick from Doctrine.